Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Tuesday, October 25th, 2022. And tonight's topic is the identified patient. Interestingly, when I've looked back in our history, the identified patient that I've done previously has shown up either at the top or even one and two, because there were two earlier versions of it. So there's something about this topic that attracts people. I don't know if it's because it's a term that people aren't familiar with, if it draws people in because we are going to be focusing on the identified patient, or because people are looking for an alternative to it. Whatever the case might be, I'm here to do it again, and I've added a bit of content to tonight's presentations, tonight's broadcast. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the history of treatment and in a very broad perspective, from a 10,000-foot perspective, and talk about some of the contributors to this idea of the identified patient. But I want to start off by telling you something I think is fascinating. My degrees, both my master's and my doctoral degree, are in marriage and family therapy. So when I showed up in graduate school, the announcement was made by all of my professors that the time of treating the identified patient alone, that one person was dead, and that we were going to be treating family in systems, and that they shared with us a plethora of anecdotal experiences, of theoretical models, and of research that showed the effectiveness of bringing everybody into the treatment process, no matter what the presenting symptom or issue was in one person. So that was what I was being taught in the classroom. Fast forward a few years, when I got my first real job outside of the clinics and the programs that were associated with my graduate school, but actually got a real job, which was in wilderness therapy. I walked into the wilderness, literally and figuratively, met with the identified patient, and I thought to myself, this is going to be my opportunity to follow through on what all of my professors had been teaching me. I'm going to bring the parents into the process. Back then, there was no family program, and virtually none. There was a short graduation process, and each family received about a half an hour update. Not about a half an hour, a maximum of a half an hour update each week from their therapist. That was the total amount of family contact. And we were encouraged emphatically to make sure that we recommended that the kids didn't come home after treatment, because that didn't bode well. So here I come with all this enthusiasm and idealism of youth, of my recent degrees, with the flags that my professors had told me that I would be carrying farther, and I was told literally, and this is a quote, that you're wasting your time if you spend extra time talking to the families and bringing them into the process. So shortly after that, I was deflated. We pushed against the system. A couple of other family therapists came on board. We continued to expand family services. And then in 1998, Second Nature, Evoke Therapy Program's predecessor, was born. And as Evoke Therapy grew, and especially in 2015, when Evoke Therapy took on its new version, the version that it is today, we've added more and more family program and family support. Initially, my thinking was, it's really about, because the families, or the parents that is, are the most powerful ones in the system. That's the way I thought about it. And so if you could intervene with the individual that had the most power, then you could be most effective. But what I've come to realize later on, especially after having raised a few of my children through their teen years, is that parents need support. They need compassion. They don't need cheap or insulting labels. They don't need more shame or more blame or more derision from therapists who are treating their children, but they need the same kind of compassion that same therapist would offer the identified patient. And so that has become my life's work, to speak for the identified patient, but also to speak to the non-identified patient, and the hurt and the shame and the burdens and the anxiety and the depression that they carry with them into this process. They struggle with a child who's struggling with addictive behaviors or with mental health issues. So historically, prior to around the 1960s, everybody psychotherapy was seen as something you do with individuals. There were some group sessions in mental health hospitals, early in the early days, often referred to as asylums. There were group therapy sessions, but it wasn't looking at and measuring what went on between the individuals. in the family of origin, or even at times between the individuals in the group setting. And what systems theory brought in, what the idea of treating people in relationships, was that the stuff that happens between them may be a more important phenomenon to understanding, to crack the code, to uncover what was going on with one individual or another in the family. It might be more important or valuable or worthwhile to study what was going on between people. So there were a few folks, and this is not a comprehensive list, but these are definitely a few of the main players starting off, and I'm going to talk about them. One was Salvador Minuchin, and he was head of the child guidance clinic, child and family guidance clinic in Philadelphia. And he was studying a couple of populations. One was children suffering with diabetes. And what they were able to show in those early days is that the presence of the parents and certain kind of communication caused the blood sugar level in the identified patient to rise and fall. That there was something happening in the system that impacted the child, not just their mental health, not just the emotional climate, but actually something that changed their physiology. And Salvador Minuchin started to study families that were anorexic, that had one client that was anorexic, or one family member that was anorexic, diabetes, like I said. And they started to see that when they made shifts with one person, when they gave assignments, when they reorganized the family by giving each person new responsibilities and taking away old ones, that people started to get healthier and that they were able to maintain that health. So Salvador Minuchin developed ideas like enmeshment and boundaries. He talked about the stuff between people. And Aristotle has a famous quote that to explain systems that says, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And Minuchin and the others that I'm going to talk about grabbed onto that idea and said, there's something additive, right? There's something about this that's more than just 1 + 1 = 2, but 1 + 1 = 3 or more. There's something about that relationship. So Minuchin was a big contributor. He wrote something called Structural Family Therapy, wrote several books and shared his findings, and that became one of the building blocks of the family systems, or the non-identified patient approach. The Palo Alto group, outside of Stanford University, associated with Stanford University, they came in and they used systems theory, specifically the idea of computers and systems, and tried to apply it to families. And one of the things they did is they filmed families in their home. At first, they weren't looking for intervention, how to treat these individuals. They just wanted to see what was happening, to understand how family systems created a dynamic, a repeating pattern that became predictable. And one of their great contributions was this idea that it wasn't the initial stressor that was the core of the problem or the issue that needed treatment. It wasn't that dad lost his job, or mother got sick, or junior had some trouble with mathematics, but it was the attempted solution that became the problem, how the family related to these things. And they call these attempted solution, they call them attempted solution sequences. So if a family reacted with shame, or with anger, or with silence, that became the seed of the pathology in the family. And I love that, because as a person who's both trained in systems theory and also somebody who believes in and lives in the attachment-based world, the attachment theory-based world, we see this idea that it's everybody in life. This is so important. I think this expands far beyond the parents that I'm talking to perhaps today, the ones that are listening on the podcast. Everybody's going to experience some significant trauma in their life. I can imagine that somebody might not, but that's fairly unrealistic. You're going to experience the death, or the loss of a loved one, the loss of a job, the failure of something, bullying, abuse. Pick your big T trauma. Everybody's going to experience that. But it's really the way that the family handles it that becomes the basis for the health or the pathology. If a family is equipped to communicate, to hold space, to have I suppose the simplest way to say it, a healthy relationship towards that stressor, the children and the individuals in that family are able to move through it and heal and evolve as part of the process. And so when we're thinking about, when I'm looking at family systems, I'm not looking at that one incident that clearly was painful or terrifying or upsetting or hurtful. That's there, that's real, it deserves our attention. But how do you deal with it? Are you allowed to feel? Do people talk about it? Are you allowed to talk about it? Do people ask you to shut it down? Is there anxiety or angst for you to get over? Are people overwhelmed by it? Do other people act out because they're so triggered by the news or the realization of the abuse? It's all that stuff in between, what we would call, I think, small T trauma or attachment-based trauma, that's predictive of whether or not that big T trauma transmutes itself into something symptomatic later on. If the system and the individual have the wherewithal to process it, to support it, to grieve together, to get outside resources, to seek therapy or treatment or self-help, if they have healthy ways of coping with that big T trauma, then individuals in the family fare a lot better. In fact, the research I did for my dissertation says that you can't tell the difference between a family that didn't experience a specific trauma and one who did, if they were equipped to deal with it with healthy communication and boundaries in healthy ways. So the Palo Alto group had a lot to contribute to this idea, and that was one of their great contributions. The Milan school, that should be spelled school. Think of the irony and how I misspelled the word school on the slide. The Milan school in Milan, Italy. What I wanted to take from them was this idea. First of all, they did something very unique as a technique. They would have a therapist do a session, and behind a one-way mirror, everybody being aware of this, of course, there would be a group of professionals or students that would watch the session. And at some point, they would call in or call the professional back to give them some counsel or some ideas. But at some point, they would actually switch. The professionals would go out into the room and talk about the case, the family, the couple, the child. And the family or the couple would sit behind the one-way mirror and listen to the professionals talk about them. That's where we get the idea in our program of the Tuesday staff changeover, where the staff are talking about the previous week, and we call it the Milan group. We borrowed it from the Milan School of Therapy. But one thing I thought was very interesting in Milan, they had this invariant prescription, understanding as this systems model is developing. They had an idea about how the symptom of the individual, typically the child, served the family in such a way. And they had what they called the invariant prescription. And with the invariant prescription, they would, after listening to an intake, after having a session with the family early on, they would give the family an idea and an assignment with the idea. And they would say, essentially, we want to fire the identified patient from being the symptom bearer in this family. And they would have the parents on the way home from the event maybe stop by and get some gelato or a treat and sit down with the child and say, you're fired from being the identified patient, the symptom bearer. We're going to work on ourselves. Regardless of how well you are or how sick you are, we're going to work on our issues, our communication, our unhealed process. We're going to make, in essence, our lives the project. So you don't have to act out to get this attention or this treatment that is a result of your behavior or your issue. So that idea of the invariant prescription, of flipping it on its head. They also did something else there that I thought was quite ingenious. They would assign where families, specifically parents, would go on a vacation. It didn't have to be exotic or far away or expensive, but the parents would go out, maybe just a date night. They would leave the child with somebody that they trusted who had their number if they were needed, and they wouldn't tell the child where they were. Just mommy and daddy are going out for a special evening or going to take a weekend in the country, and it's a secret. And they would never tell the child. And what they were trying to do was recreate the idea of the executive system, that the parents could have boundaries. So they would intervene in very simple ways to not address the symptom, the acting out behavior, but to address the family system, and to assume what family theorists were starting to develop was true. This idea that the symptom bearer, the identified patient, the lightning rod, the focus of treatment and intervention was just a signal that something in the system was off balance. I think with your children today, if you have a child that's struggling, I think it's the same message. The child is asking for something that probably you inherited from your own family of origin. Both of you did. And they're saying whatever it was that you were doing, whatever it was that you brought to the table as parents isn't enough. And we need something else. We need outside input from a therapist, from a sponsor, from a doctor, from a mentor, from an interventionist. So the Milan School brought some of that idea. I love Murray Bowen's work because I think it offers some unique aspects of the family systems, the non-identified patient treatment model that nobody quite understands. Murray Bowen was a psychiatrist, and he supervised several psychiatry students. And what he started to notice during supervision is, first of all, like what happens in all good supervision, is he was asking questions about their relationship to the client and the client issues, how they were reacting and feeling about their clients. But he noticed, because the work was so personal with his supervisees, he noticed that they would go home for vacations, for spring break, for Christmas break, for the holiday break, for whatever it was, and they would come back with stories to tell about their reintroduction to their family system and how it was affecting them, how they regressed to a younger age, how they held resentments. Murray Bowen has this famous example where, I don't know if it was he or a student, I think it was him, where one of his parents called him to complain about the other parent, and his parents were still married. And he called the other parent. So let's say it was dad. Dad called him to complain about mom. And after he hung up, Murray called the mother and said, your husband was just calling to complain about you. You better talk to him about this because it's starting to leak. He started to show boundaries. And the interesting thing about Murray Bowen, although he's considered one of the pioneers of family therapy, is he never met with two people at the same time. So when people talk about, having the child come out to wilderness therapy, having the child come out to a therapeutic boarding school or to residential treatment, and hearing us talk about family systems and the identified patient, they don't understand that sometimes temporarily pulling people apart in the family and treating them all individually before you put them back together can be a very effective method. And that we just simply understand and see the symptoms, see the issues in a systemic context. So there was a great history until the 1960s and 70s and 80s of treating individuals. But just like a car accident, if it doesn't matter who's driving the car, doesn't matter if it's the 16 or the 17-year-old driving the car, if the family's in the car, everybody needs attention. They don't just treat the driver, but they treat everybody. Everybody's hurting, everybody's injured. Everybody's a part of the process. And what we hope for, this is one of the things we hope so much for with the families we work with, either in our wilderness program or in our intensive program, is that the parents and the other non-identified patients in the family would be willing to step into the work themselves and to model for the identified patient who is obviously compromised the courage that it takes to look at yourself, to see each member, to see how they're contributing to a process which, at least on a conscious level, they have no awareness that they're contributing to. When I take phone calls from individuals that are considering a family intensive, the first thing I say to the parents is, we're going to work through you first. We're going to put you on the proverbial hot seat first. Look at your family of origin, look at your history, look at your issues. And this will be the first indications of the child that this is not business as usual, that we're not going to pick on them, the scapegoat in the family. In addition to, really systems theory at Evoke, we talk about being an attachment theory based program. There's this idea that it's not so much that we're always studying the systemic nature of things, but we're understanding the relationship between child and parent. We understand how the unlived life or the unhealed life of a parent can be transgenerationally passed on, and the child can end up carrying it. If the parent hasn't healed their own shame, their own guilt, come to terms with it, and done significant work in that area, so therefore they have to be good, thought of as good. So much of the time, one of the common features in families that come to treatment is that there is this need to protect the ego of the parents, that the parents can't take blame. And because the parents are often living a less symptom filled life, are functioning adequately in society, don't have for sure the same problems that the child has, it's easy for them to believe the illusion that they don't have some contribution to this issue. But we understand that the parent child relationship is one relationship that is not meant to be equal, cannot be equal. That it is more than other relationships, kind of a one-way relationship. It is the job of the parent to expand and provide enough psychological wherewithal to support the child, not the other way around. And when the child comes into a family thinking that they have to behave and feel a certain way for the parent to be okay, things break down dramatically for that child. When the child has to be good, symptom free, successful, happy, and if they're not, they're led to believe that they're causing the mother and father great shame or pain or grief, the child crumbles underneath the weight of that burden. So you add attachment theory to the systems model, and you see something really profound and helpful in flipping the identified patient model on its head. I've said to my therapists, if there was only one assignment, and of course there's not, but if there was only one assignment in our program for our clients, for our young clients, the one I would choose is the impact letter that the identified patient writes to mom and dad. Here's how I was hurt. Here's what I'm angry about. Here's what I'm sad or frustrated about. In essence, very simply put, we're trying to replace symptomatic behavior and what it's trying to communicate with a conscious, assertive communication. But when I start to talk about this, dad, mom, you work too much. Mom, dad, you yelled too much. You didn't have time for me. Whatever the complaint is. When I start to talk about this, parents, because of their unhealed, unworked on shame and guilt, go to this very shameful place of feeling blame for the whole situation. It's so immediate that we translate these kinds of statements into blame in our minds because that's the way that we were raised, in this kind of simplistic either or cause and effect way. But really, I can say when you yelled at me, it hurt. And that's real. And it happened. But how I chose to deal with it was maybe by yelling back or by self-medicating or by withdrawing or cutting off. There still is accountability in that. But to get to that accountability, which, by the way, most of my young therapists, when they start, and most of the parents and the referring professionals who talk to us would tell you they would prefer the letter of accountability, or the letter of awareness, as we call it, to be the first or the only letter if there were only one assignment. They would say things like, well, we know that our son or my daughter, my child is angry. We know that they blame us for all of their problems. But can they be accountable for their reaction? Because at the end of the day, they are accountable for how they choose to respond to things. But to grease the skids, to make it more effective, we start off with the anger, the hurt, the rage, the sadness, the powerlessness, and the grief. In fact, if a child is reluctant at all, we even allow it to look pretty blaming, pretty unassertive. We're willing to walk through any door to get inside of the identified patient's heart if we can find a way in. And if we find a way in through rage and through blame, so be it. And I've seen the opposite happen where children in programs look institutionalized, where I come and they're qualifying everything. Well, I'm angry at my father and the divorce, but I know it's my fault. I'm not victim shame. I'm not playing the victim role. I'm not blame shifting. I'm still responsible for my choices. And I've had to, at times, stop them and say, it's okay. You don't have to qualify that you're angry at your parents for the divorce or that you're sad that your mother works too much, or that your father doesn't talk about emotions or can't hear you when you're sad. You can just say that. This space you have in this session right now, we don't have the need to defend your parents that they are good and blameless. The identified patient gets the attention and that they serve to distract the family from the real, more difficult problem to address, which is everybody's work. Similar to the idea in the Jewish faith of a scapegoat, right? Placing the sins of the community onto the goat and sending it out to be sacrificed. The identified patient carries, if you will, the sins of the family, hidden and disguised. And even, remember this is so fascinating. Mental health symptoms, if they're to be effective, are meant to distract everybody and anybody from what the real issue is. You know the old saying that the person who needs love the most is sometimes the hardest one to give it to? That's the idea. See, the child in the identified patient model, if we're assuming it's a child, the child is threatened and scared and vulnerable. And so the acting out is to throw everybody off track, to put up a smoke screen. Carl Jung said, one of his most famous quotes is that neuroses or mental health issues is a substitute for legitimate suffering. If we can talk about numbers on a scale for an anorexic, or numbers of times, or what drugs you're using, or how many times you skip school, or your GPA, or what language you use that was disrespectful. If we can talk about the behaviors, if we can reduce the problem to behaviors, then we don't have to deal with the feelings that are so hard for everybody to confront, to absorb, to deal with, to tangle with. So the idea is the identified patient protects the family, becomes the most symptomatic. Let me be clear about this. The identified patient does become symptomatic. It's not an illusion. They fill the ticket. They meet the request that the family's unconsciously asking for. A very common thing that happens in families is that the child will become symptomatic when the parents can't get on the same page, or when the marriage is in trouble. In fact, I've heard people say in the last 2 weeks, I've heard somebody say that they wanted to have a child to save the marriage. And what we know in family systems and attachment theory, I should say psychology, is that that's a disastrous effort. And really what happens is the child becomes the receptor of the anxiety in the family. I hear this on this broadcast when I do my question and answer all the time. Siblings will tell me, or parents will tell me about siblings. Once Susie or Johnny got off the treatment or seems to be doing better, now the focus is on child number 2 or 3 in the family. The angst, the anxiety, the feelings have to go somewhere if the parents and the others in the family aren't willing to own them and to sort them out themselves. So the function of the symptom, this idea that it serves a function to protect and preserve the family's togetherness, and then nobody's so threatened that they'll walk away. And this came to the idea of triangles. Triangles was an idea developed by Murray Bowen, one of the founders that I was talking about earlier. This idea that you take the anxiety between two people and you transfer it to a third. I have it in a drawing here that I've drawn for you. When they're in, and I forgive the simplicity of the genders. I have represented here what seems to be a female presenting and a male presenting. Anyway, a mother and a father, and if there's tension or anxiety or disconnect between them, instead of focusing on that, they'll make the child the problem. But there's also another thing that attachment theory offers that's a little bit different. If an individual parent doesn't have the wherewithal to cope with stress, anxiety, sadness, grief, powerlessness, hurt, in essence, enough wherewithal to deal with life, they'll take that badness represented on this this drawing as a kind of a red splotch inside of the heart of the parent, and they'll make the child the problem. In other words, it's my child and their drug issue that's causing me to not sleep. It's my child's self-harm that's causing my lack of focus at work. It's my child's school refusal and rebellion that's causing the problem in our divorce. So we project onto others. We abdicate the responsibility for our own life and make the other person the problem. And of course, psychological health is the opposite of that. Psychological health assumes the reason that I'm unhappy is because of the way that I'm living my life, and I take responsibility for that. The idea in parenting and attachment theory is that our children stretch us. I remember I've shared this story before that my adult daughter she's not at the point where she's decided to have children or not, but she was contemplating the idea about if her life could be full and she could define it the way that she wants to without children. And of course, I don't know what decision she needs to make for her life. That's none of my business. But I was thinking about it from a theoretical perspective. And what I know is that there's something that happens when you raise a child that you learn that you don't learn any other way, which is you get stretched, you get expanded, or you don't, and everybody suffers greatly. You know the saying that I share with you on occasion that says, if you're the same person you were 10 years ago, you're the same person today you were 10 years ago, you've wasted 10 years. Or if you're the same person in 10 years from now that you are today, you've wasted 10 years. This is about an evolving process. We have to learn what we don't know and learn that we don't know and that we don't have all the answers, that we're living a human fallible experience, as are our children. There's this idea of codependency and co-participation that I think also is a part of. It's interesting because codependency, I think, is an attempt to kind of destroy the idea of treating the identified patient. You know, you're saying, yes, there's a person struggling with alcohol or substance addiction, sometimes other mental health issues, and I become codependent with them by enabling them, meaning that I let them get away with things. I clean up after them. I clean up the mess. I reduce the consequences, the natural consequences of their behavior, because I don't want to see them suffer. I think that's the kind of the simple idea of codependency. But the fact of the matter is that codependency is present in everybody's life. Codependency is just a lack of awareness of psychological boundaries, of what it means to be in relationship to another person, what it means to be in relationship to yourself, to a self. And so beyond just looking like there's a codependent and there's a person suffering from an addiction or a person suffering from depression, we would say that everybody in the family has an issue. Some look more obviously symptomatic, some less. And that if a person in the codependent role heals their codependency or gets into recovery for their codependency, it doesn't fix the person with depression or their child with depression or addiction. I think that's one of the most harmful things that's taught in our field today, is that if you set good boundaries and you do everything right, it could even be extrapolated from things I've already said tonight. If you do everything right or well or better, your child will get better. But the whole idea of codependency, of poor boundaries, is just that you can control another person, that they are the effect, so to speak, of your cause. But we think beyond that when we talk about attachment-based therapy at Evoke. We think beyond that. We think the only thing that happens when you heal your codependency is that you feel more peace of mind, more clarity, more grounded, less anxious, less depressed. And that, while that doesn't fix the child who might be struggling with these specific issues, it's better. It's an environment that's closer to optimal. But at the end of the day, The child still has their agencies. The person struggling with alcoholism or addiction or depression or anxiety still has a responsibility. So the outcome of your healing, mom and dad, husband, wife, brother, sister, or even adult son or adult daughter, the result of your healing is that you feel better. You have a better life. You have clear relationships. You become disentangled from the drama of the identified patient, from the very idea of cause and effect. And like I said, while that doesn't cure the addict or cure the person suffering with addiction or cure the person suffering with anxiety or self-harm, while it doesn't cure them, the ripple effects show up in some ways. And at least you're not contributing to the problem in ways that you were before. Melanie Klein, one of the masters of attachment-based therapy or analytic theory, talks about how human beings go through two phases. In infancy, we start off in the paranoid position, which is the threat is out there, the problem is out there, and that if we grow and mature, we move into the depressed position, which is the problem is in here. And while depressed position doesn't sound like you've arrived at something wonderful, the great thing about the depressed position, which is at first an overwhelming sense, an overwhelming feeling that it's your responsibility, is that you can change it. If the problem is in you, then you can solve it. If the problem is out there and you come to therapists for tricks and for hacks about how to change your child, how to change your spouse, you'll forever remain in the paranoid position. But the great paradox, there's so many paradoxes, and the great irony in the work is regardless of your relationship to the identified patient, if your life improves, the situation improves. Of course, markedly for you, but also for them. You become more of a resource than a liability. And so coming to the child with your anger, your angst, your frustration, your disappointment, your hurt, your terror, and hoping that all of that energy will motivate them to wake up, to live the life that they should be living. That's the thought that you have because that's the thought that your parents have, because frankly, that's the thought that most people have on the planet. Is that a mother and father, a parent, a grandparent who comes to a child with all of that negative feeling because the child is acting out or acting in or harming themselves, that somehow that will create motivation, actually has in most cases the opposite effect. It adds to the problem and to the issue. That's why we have support groups for parents. Not to stop you from being the cause of their problem, but to stop you from being the cause of your problem. Same with marital therapy. You come to realize your contribution to the issue. If you're the one who's always talking and the other partner is not talking enough, let's talk about how it's not safe to talk to you. And if you're the person who doesn't like to talk and wants to keep it closed, let's talk about how you're not honest with your truth. Let's talk about what your project is. That's the great shift. I always say in our family intensives, if it goes well, we don't finish or fix everything. Of course, that's silly in 2 to 5 days. But each participant walks away with a clear sense of what is their project. And if you've been somebody else's project, you know how bad that sucks. No identified patient, no child likes to be the project. It's a burden. It's a threat. The transformation occurs when the identified patient pulls the family into treatment and the family gets the attention, the shift, the intervention, the outside energy, resources, and intelligence that it needs. And every family can benefit from it. People get confused when I talk about how much treatment I and my family go to, but we need it just like everybody else. We need outside ideas, outside information, outside perspective. We need to restructure things. I've definitely fixed some of the issues that were inherent in my family of origin, but I promise you this, I brought some new ones into it too. And the same is true of course, of my wife. Years ago, I was talking about the idea of intervention. I presented at a conference about intervention, that old idea where everybody who cares about the identified patient comes together. Oftentimes they prepared a letter and they read to the person of interest, the person that's the focus, with the ultimate invitation that they go to treatment. But part of the idea that I presented is the intervention works even if the person doesn't go to treatment, because we've reorganized the family. We've got everybody on the same page, working on the same project, which is communication, boundaries, not talking behind each other's back, not blaming, not triangulating. That is, taking the anxiety from this relationship and projecting it onto the person that's most vulnerable. The intervention works because it shifts the family structure. And so in the case of, for example, an addict who's been stealing, somebody who's struggling with addiction who's been stealing, everybody agrees that they're not going to loan them any more money. For example, it's up to the family, of course, but something like that. So everybody is improved, even if the person suffering from the issue, the disorder, doesn't accept the invitation. And by the way, oftentimes interventions, when they don't work initially, they work days or weeks later because of the shift in the family. Because the family and the individuals who have thought themselves as the healthy ones prior to this are not contributing to the very problem that they're complaining about. And in the end, the amazing thing about the identified patient, and in fact, I thought about it a lot like the hero's journey that I often talk about from Joseph Campbell's work, the identified patient becomes the hero. I cannot tell you how many times I have heard a parent say, the gift of this treatment process, although I wouldn't wish it on anybody else, it's a beautiful gift. It's wrapped. In fact, I think there's a blog that a parent wrote on our website about this. It's wrapped in really crappy wrapping paper. But the gift inside of it is that everybody feels better. I've had parents tell me that their attendance at Al-Anon, that they resisted for weeks but finally accepted the invitation to attend Al-Anon, has changed their life. I hear parents talk about the transformation that they've gone through in this process with varying levels of success of outcomes in terms of their children. But the parents who love this work, the ones who are probably listening tonight live, you're either new or you're listening because you realize that this is the fruit, the sweet fruit for you. I talked about this last night. I know I've thought this, and I've sensed it from the clients that I've worked with, that the therapist is going to give us some secret knowledge about how to get around reality, about how to magically change things. Some silver bullet, some 3 or 4 or 5 step hack. Within my own system at time, I've been pressed for a way to kind of boil it down into 3 or 4 or 5 or 7 things. And while that's tempting, and believe me, if I had that information or I found it anywhere, I would share it with you. The real work is heroic, and it's heroic because it's sustained. It lasts the rest of your life. It's a different way of thinking and feeling about yourself, about mental health, about good and bad, right and wrong, cause and effect, relationships, responsibilities to parents, responsibilities to children, responsibilities to community. It's a different level of consciousness, a different way of thinking. And that's what the hero eventually gives back to the community. Related to the principles of this systemic identified patient idea is that within a system, there is a homeostatic force, like a thermostat on a wall, that that keeps that attempts to keep things the same. If you get a healthy boundary, mom and dad, brother, sister, husband or wife, partner, if you take a step towards healthy boundaries, you can expect for the system to try to pull you back down to the status quo. Anything outside the range of the usual, the typical, will be resisted. So we look at homeostatic energy in a family. If you got a healthy boundary with your kid, better believe you're going to be accused of not loving them, of being cruel, of betraying them, of abandoning them, maybe being selfish, maybe being a sucker and listening to therapists or experts and not being your own. Whatever insult would be most likely to work is most likely what you're going to get, because that's the wisdom of the family, right? That's the family's culture. Certain families, it's not okay to be angry. It's not okay to be sexual. It's not okay to be sad. It's not okay to fail. It's not okay to feel or be something. And that's what you'll be accused of being. Equal finality is in equal potentiality is a system, a general systems idea that says that the same beginnings can have different ends, and the same ends can come from different beginnings. In other words, you could grow up in the home having been abused by your parent physically, and you could either become an abuser yourself or become a social worker who helps other abused children. And the ingredient that shifts that from one to the other is you. Or you could become a wonderful, artistic, gifted, loving, creative, talented, smart person. And you could have come from an abusive family, or you could have come from a nurturing family with lots of privilege. The fact of the matter is, in looking at complex systems like families and people, it's not a clear linear idea. And that's why we have to remain open and listening. We have to wait until the idea, the energy, and the pattern reveals itself. And the punctuation that we use is arbitrary. You know, children that are slow to warm up, not easy to soothe, have an effect on the parent's nervous system. And when the parent's nervous system is taxed, and they go into fight or flight mode, they can become reactive and punishing to the child, which is then going to trigger the child. So where we punctuate it, and that goes over and over and snowballs. Where we punctuate it is irrelevant, right? We can punctuate it anywhere. And that's the one part of systems theory that I still hold to as an attachment-based therapist, is that I'll just start where you're at. If you show up in my office or at my campfire in the wilderness, we'll start where you want to start. It's as valid a place as any to start. We model humility and vulnerability and let go of the outcome while shifting our energy. In other words, the story I tell about the mother whose son blamed her for his dishonesty because she was so judgmental, which she validated and then turned to me afterwards and said, "But how do I teach him accountability?" And my answer was, "You just did." You want your children to have success in a treatment process? Go to Al-Anon. Go to a support group. Hire a therapist. Start going without any answers. Watch how uncomfortable it feels to share your story. It's the exact same thing you're asking of the child. Modeling the strength to say, I might be contributing to this issue in some way, is nothing less than heroic. And very few parents do it. It is the exception to the rule. And I think the thing that probably motivates a lot of the parents who can do it is the desperation that they've tried everything else. Learning to say you're sorry and practicing a 10th step, that's borrowing from the 12 steps. Taking a daily inventory. Sometimes when I'm talking to a family that's inquiring about one of our programs, to give them a nugget to go away with, I'll say, Just find one thing to apologize to your child about. See, when we can apologize to our child, when we can be wrong, we're showing our children that they can be wrong and that it's okay, that it's survivable, that the relationship is survivable. But because we still at times carry around this notion that our parents and their parents and their parents handed to us, that we have to be good and right and worthy, we're terrified to see our part in things. We feel like everything, the whole house, is going to come crumbling down on top of us if we made a contribution to the problem. That's why I think that attending Al-Anon or Codependence Anonymous is so amazing, because you learn to practice to work on your stuff, to stay on your side of the street and keep it clean. Embark on your own journey. Do your own work. I shared this last night, but perhaps the most important thing I can share with you tonight in kind of countering the idea of the identified patient is what Daniel Siegel said. The strongest predictor, the most renowned psychiatrist in the United States, the strongest predictor of a child's well-being is a parent's self-understanding. If you're defensive, if you're resistant to treatment, it doesn't bode well for the child. That's the idea. I was giving a talk. This happened a lot of times, but one particular time, I remember when I had had enough of this. When I heard it for the last time, not the last time, but in a sense, it was a turning point for me. Somebody walked up to me after a talk I'd given in Toronto. This is 10 years ago or so, and said, "I feel shame when I hear you talk about this stuff. Although you say you don't, I still hear as if it's my fault." What I can tell you is this: at the end of the day, just like with your child, how you live your life will be the determining factor on whether or not you have a happy life. And by happy, I don't mean like skip along superficially and everything is happy and hunky dory. I just mean a meaningful life worth living will be how you live your life. And if you don't take that responsibility and you abdicate it and place it on your children's shoulders, they will pay the price. So, yes, I can look at myself. I can see how I contribute to my child's issues. I've shared the story that when we sent my son on a wilderness experience a few years ago, he's now 20, I believe he was 16 or 17 at the time. The first letter that my wife wrote said, "It's not lost on me the irony that we sent you to this program to help you, in part at least, get rid of some issues or some behaviors that you put in place to protect you from us." In other words, she was saying, we're part of this. Or my client that went to his dying sister, dying from the effects of alcohol. Very, very successful. My client is in every way. And he went to his sister who eventually died of alcoholism and had the courage to say to her, "I have just as many problems as you." And she looked at him so incredulously, so not believing. And he said it with an honest heart and as a gift to her, that he'd come to realize through his own therapy that he started, by the way, because of his children's depression and anxiety. And he'd come to realize that while he had navigated some things much better than they had, that he still carried some of the same wounds, some of the same issues that he saw in them. What can we accomplish for the family? We can help them identify and change the project from fixing the child to fixing yourself. We can help reorganize the family and help them balance, which are the two basic tasks of developing empathy and non-judgment for the child and doing the difficult, painful, transformative work of setting boundaries and becoming a self. We can give the family a chance to heal as a whole and offer everybody support. Even if it worked with one of your other children, the child in treatment might be asking for something that you haven't yet acquired for yourself. We can give each individual a voice, especially the identified patient who has oftentimes been reduced to their symptoms. And if done properly, the identified patient will understand that they are loved even before they know how to love themselves. And of course, we never lose hope. Like I said, when I get a call from parents, if they will allow me to, I'll walk into the family system through them and their issues first. And after we get in there, then it's safe for everybody. We honor the defense. What does it mean to honor the defense? We honor the defense by acknowledging that the defense or the symptom or the identified patient is serving a function in the system. And if we can treat the issue that's at the heart of that function, the symptom doesn't automatically magically go away, but there becomes less of a need or a reason for it. And in that context, it's easier to get out of it. Mental health and mental illness are simply a continuum that we are all on. And mental illness is really just a pattern of behaviors that become somewhat compulsive or predictive that protects somebody from unwanted feelings and threats. Nothing more than that. And we can reduce the idea that the child is nothing more than a symptom or an outcome of the parent's behavior. That everybody has their part to play. We can help parents learn that it's okay to not know everything, not have the answers. That you don't get to be good anymore, but you do get to be a person. And if there's anything I'm passionate about, especially when I'm talking on these broadcasts, it is that you parents deserve love and respect and compassion in an effort to heal you and your children, not names and labels and insults. We need to treat you the same way we're asking you to treat your children, really, with the same compassion, the same unending patience. You learn to listen, you learn to say you're sorry, you learn to show up as you are, and the result is a greater connection to the child. A couple of quotes as we close. J.D. Gill wrote, "It is important to recognize that the defense is doing important psychological work, or the energy required to maintain it would not make sense. Ripping away defenses does not improve the situation. Taking them away before the person is able to tolerate what the defense is masked leaves the person worse off than before. At least before, with the defense, he or she could function. Now he or she is incapable. Both cruel people and inadequate therapists are famous for a desire to destroy defenses without considering the consequences." And from motivational interviewing, your purpose is to understand the life before you, to see the world through this person's eyes rather than superimposing your own vision. Rogers and his students describe well the therapeutic skill of accurate empathy. It is, quote, to sense the client's inner world of private personal meanings as if it were your own, but without ever losing the as if quality, still maintaining a sense of separateness. The opposite of empathy is the imposition of one's own perspective, perhaps with the assumption that the other's views are irrelevant or misguided. A codependent person is one who has let another person's behavior affect him or her, and who is obsessed with controlling that person's behavior. Melanie Beatty said that. And the same way that codependents will not conclude that since efforts to stop the addict have been futile, there is no way of controlling the addict. Rather, they will look for new ways that it will work. If you've tried something over and over and the child isn't getting it, the child may not be the slow learner. And finally, a compulsive act can be irrational, yet the urge to do it may become virtually irresistible. I had a father tell me years ago, after his son had come home, they'd set up a contract and his son had basically one by one betrayed every rule in the contract. And he went upstairs. He said this to me after the fact, and he said, "Brad, I knew not to yell. I knew not to lecture, but I said to my son, because I couldn't tolerate it, I can't believe you've broken all the rules. You knew what to do. You knew what the consequences would be, but you did it anyway. And I can't understand it." And he told me this, of course, in a moment of catharsis and inventing. And I pointed out to him, of course, the irony. And I said, "Do you realize you just told me a story where you did something that you knew you weren't supposed to do, but you did it anyway by lecturing and yelling at your kids saying, I can't believe you're doing something that you know you're not supposed to do?" We can look at ourselves. To understand somebody, I wrote, you may have to lose your mind. And lastly, what Carl Jung said was, if you want to understand your child and their issues, understand your own. Or in his words, knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of others. I'm going to end with this last story and quote from Abraham Tversky's book, Addictive Thinking. He wrote, the mother of a young man who was destroying himself with alcohol and other drugs could not understand how he could be could not understand how he could be oblivious to the disastrous effects that chemicals were having on his life. She asked for help in dealing with him. But don't tell me I have to put him out of the house, or that I should not bail him out of jail, she said. I don't want to hear that. Tversky responded, please tell me how much is 2 plus 2, but don't say 4. She had been unable to see that her own thinking was no less distorted than her son's. So what are the take-homes? Volunteer to be the identified patient yourself. Look at your stuff. Become aware of it. Have that be a part of the family's consciousness that you have issues. Learn to reduce your shame, the language that communicates it toward yourself and towards others. We are angry and critical and shameful because it's an easier substitute than the terrifying work of setting boundaries and just being a self. We love to be righteous. We love to be right. We learn the difference between giving a gift of love and giving and hoping something back. It's part of what families learn in this process. Learn to take ownership for your own feelings and your own life. That your happiness is your responsibility and your child doesn't owe it to you. Making your serenity and your self-esteem your project. And again, notice I'm not saying that you just become happy or you become somebody who feels good about themselves or has no shame or has no anxiety, but it's your project. And once it's your project, there comes the silver lining, the hope. Discover that the wisdom that this journey has to offer. And if you do all of this well, when your child is in a crisis, you can become the first phone call, not the last one. And moving the scapegoat's role from the scapegoat to the hero to the one that got your attention is a great practice of gratitude. And then to learn to have the courage to consider that you may be contributing to the problem. I hope that gives you some hope. I hope that hearing about this, by the way, I'm in this with you as always. This is our struggle. And if you want to help your child, help yourself first. Figure out what your contributions are to the psychological dynamics in the family. It doesn't matter if you're only 1% of the problem. I tell parents, take 100% responsibility for 1%, and you're doing just fine. All right, looks like I'm out of time for questions. I can take those in our next broadcast. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon and Audible. We have 2 full classes of our Conscious Parenting Workshop. I'll be opening up another one soon, so look for that. That's an all-day workshop that I'll be hosting, interactive workshop online. We had 1 spot left for the November 9th through 13th Finding You Intensive. This is, in my opinion, the best thing you can do, the best way to spend your resources of time and money to help your child, in addition to what you might have already done in terms of their treatment, is attending a Finding You or workshop either in person or online. Contact intensives@evoketherapy.com for more information. The next online offering is November 11th through 13th. I know we have 2 spots left in that one. If you are in a wilderness or an alumni parent, our next offering for a support group, free support group, is October 26th and then November 3rd after that. We have one of those each week. Once a month, we have a meeting just for alumni members only. November 22nd is the next offering for that. And then we have a support group for our intensives alumni. November 8th is our next offering for that. Malia at evoketherapy.com is the place to go for that. If you would like a life coach, parent coach, couples coach who is educated in the Evoke Therapy way, please contact coaching at evoketherapy.com for more information about our coaches. We have pursuit trips. These are 3 to 30-day programs for adults or families. Think sober, fun, or therapy light. Customized for anywhere around the world, any activities. We ask all current parents to attend any combination of 6 of the following 12-step support groups: Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, or Adult Children. You can also go to refugerecovery.org or NAMI.org for free classes and resources in your area. All of these broadcasts are available on Spotify or your favorite podcast app. Just search Finding You an Evoke Therapy Podcast or go to soundcloud.com on your computer. You can also go to our YouTube channel, Evoke's YouTube channel, and watch the presentation there with the slides and the quotes on screen. You can find Evoke Therapy programs and me, Dr. Brad Reedy, on Twitter and Instagram using the handles at Evoke Therapy and at Dr. Brad Reedy. Or you can find Evoke Intensives on Instagram using the handle at Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. Of course, we have new blog content each week curated by Malia and contributed to by all of our staff. Wonderful content there each week. If you'd like to give back for people that can't afford therapy, our 3 charitable partners include ChooseMentalHealth.org, Sky'sTheLimitFund.org, or the EvokeFamilyFoundation.org. And in honor of my very dear friend who just passed away last month, Peter Brown, the Evoke Family Foundation has earmarked a portion of their funds to go to the Peter Brown Pride Fund for individuals who identify as LGBTQ+. So you can donate directly and earmark it for that. My next broadcast will be November 3rd at 6:30 p.m. That'll be a Q&A for family and friends. All right, folks. That was a long one tonight. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for participating. Thanks for listening. For and on behalf of the people that love you and that you love, thank you for being willing to do your work. And thank you as the non-identified patient in many cases for a willingness to be open to how you might be a contributor to the solution and stop contributing to the problem. So for and on behalf of the people that love you and that you love, thank you for joining me. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.